By default, Reporting Services is set up to use Windows Integrated Security. If you have some users who will be connecting to reports via browsers other than Internet Explorer or outside of an intranet, such as across the Internet, you'll likely want to configure your report server to support basic authentication. Because SQL Server no longer uses Internet Information Services, or IIS, in order to host reporting services, you can no longer use the IIS Management Console application to manage reporting services authentication as you could in previous versions of reporting services. Instead, you need to edit the rsReportServer.config file in order to enable basic authentication. The first thing you need to do to edit the rsReportServer.config file, of course, is to find it. And this is the location. I have Windows Explorer open to it. I can display the entire path. This is for an installation of SQL Server 2014 and the reporting services that comes with that version of SQL Server. So by default, it's in the C drive, Program Files, Microsoft SQL Server, MSRS for Reporting Services 12. 12 is the version number of reporting services for SQL Server 2014. Then the default name of the instance of SQL Server, it's MS SQL Server by default, but you can change that during installation. Reporting Services and Report Server, and you can find the file right there. So I want to open this up in Visual Studio, but any text editor works. If you have a nice XML editor, that's great. Visual Studio 2013 has a very fine XML editor, so I'll open it up with that. Okay, and there's the XML for that file. As you can see here, it's quite a long file, a lot of settings, but this file includes a lot of the settings that you can configure. A slightly disturbingly high percentage of settings for reporting services require that you come here in order to change the setting. But a lot of them are also exposed by a number of property dialog boxes within Management Studio and Report Manager. So it's kind of a combination of things. Now what I want is the authentication element. The easiest way to find it is to select the Edit Outlining, toggle All Outlining to collapse the entire file, and then selectively expand it. So that shows the root element of configuration as well as the first set of child elements. So you can see I can go directly to authentication, expand that, and expand this authentication types. Now, in this pristine authentication element, I haven't made any changes to this. This is the default authentication and authentication types element that are installed as part of this config file with a fresh installation of reporting services. So what I need to do is add an additional authentication type. So I'll come in here. Actually, I'm going to do a Control-KD, just kind of get the file to conform to my tab sizes and how I've configured Visual Studio. So I need to put in the RS Windows Basic authentication type. I can complete it like that. Okay. So just by entering that setting alone, now we'll enable basic authentication. But I can go a step further. There's a couple of additional settings that I can include. So I'm going to unclose that element. And actually, I'll let Visual Studio work for me. So I just got rid of the closing angle bracket, and that put in the closing tag for RS Windows Basic. And I'm going to add the logon method and the realm capitalization matters, and the default domain elements. Okay, now I'm not actually going to enter any values here. Oh, yeah, I do want for logon method. Okay. So those are optional, consider them parameters that you can use. So just real basically, the logon method lets you select between network and clear text logons. And then realm lets you specify a resource partition that includes authorization and authentication features to control access. And then default domain lets you specify the server to use to authenticate the user. Now, just additional options, keep in mind that you can configure basic authentication. I don't want to go into the nitty-gritty detail of all of these options because they really get pretty esoteric. But you can check out the Configure Basic Authentication on the report server. That's a help topic for the version of reporting services that you're using. There's one for each of the versions of reporting services, and that goes into great detail about what all these options are. But just keep in mind, just keep in the back of your mind that if you need to use basic authentication, you can configure it using those additional parameters within the rs report server.config file. Okay, so that's all you need to do to enable that, and now you have that available as an authentication option. One big caveat to using basic authentication. Basic authentication, which is a web standard, supplies credentials in clear text. The basic authentication protocol does nothing to protect your credentials. So, if you're going to use this option, you are always going to want to enable SSL for that report server connection, for all report server connections. A great way to enhance the security of your reporting services sessions is to require Secure Sockets Layer, or SSL, require SSL access to reporting services. Requiring SSL is especially important when turning on basic authentication, as I mentioned. You can configure SSL using the Reporting Services Configuration Manager utility for either web service or Report Manager URLs, or both of them. Now, strictly speaking, although it's still in use, the SSL protocol is rapidly becoming an obsolete technology. The last update to the specification, version 3.0 of SSL, came out in 1996, which is a lifetime ago in Internet years. The replacement technology is the Transport Layer Security, or TLS, which was first released in 1999 and last updated in 2008 with version 1.2. And the next version, 1.3, is in active development right now. TLS provides the same basic service as SSL to provide for encrypted communications over a network. And the two specifications function similarly. But TLS modernized SSL and made it more secure. Modern browsers, server software, and other internet-based software largely support TLS 1.2, while supporting earlier versions of TLS and SSL for backwards compatibility when communicating with older or non-updated software. But for the most part, people refer to both SSL and TLS as SSL. So I'm going to go with that here. And as you'll see, the dialog boxes in SQL Server and reporting services usually refer to SSL. So this will avoid confusion. But just keep in mind that TLS, same kind of services as SSL, but you want to use TLS anytime you have an option. To enable SSL for Report Server and the Reporting Services web service, there's several steps that you have to follow. Now, the first step is to purchase and install an SSL certificate from a Trusted Certificate Authority, or CA, to use on the server hosting the SQL Server reporting services. Now, I have a couple options here. If IIS is installed on the report server, reporting services doesn't use it, but you can use IIS for managing certificates. But if it is installed on the report server, you can use the IIS Management Console program to generate the certificate request and install the purchased certificate. Even though, again, reporting services doesn't use IIS, this makes the certificate available to reporting services. It's essentially storing it within Windows. But if IIS is not installed on the report server, Windows Server provides a certificate snap-in tool that you can use to generate the certificate request and install the purchased certificate. So what I'm going to do is assume that that step has been taken. I'm not going to be using any third-party certificates for this. I can show you the general steps without one, fortunately. All right, so the next thing I need to do is fire up the Reporting Services Configuration Manager, because that's where I configure the instance of Reporting Services to use SSL. So I'll go over here, Reporting Services Configuration Manager, UAC. And I need to connect to an instance, so I'll connect to my local instance there. And remember that there are two different URLs that you can modify. And we need to implement SSL on both. We don't need to, but if you're going to install it for one, you may as well install it for both and have full protection. All right, so I'm going to go to the web service URL. And here is where you define the name of the virtual directory for the web service. By default, it's report server, but you can name it anything you want. Which IP addresses to watch. In this case, the default, well, in all cases, the default is all assigned. But if there are other IP addresses on this machine, you can select a specific IP address. Specify a port. 80 is the default HTTP port. You can change it if you want to. But here is where you can modify the SSL certificate. I don't have one installed right now, so I'll select that box there. And notice that I only have a single available certificate, IIS Express Development Certificate. This is a certificate that's installed with IIS Express, which is essentially IIS Lite for development work on a local development machine. Perfect for this kind of situation where I'm really not going to be developing applications that are going to connect to this server in order to access the report server. Okay, so I'll select that. And by default, it sets the SSL port to 443. That's the default SSL port, but you can select that text box there and change it to any port number that you want. All right, so notice that I now have two URLs. One is the main URL, so I generally use localhost here instead of the machine name, /report server. And then I now have a second URL that uses HTTPS, that protocol, goes against localhost 443, that port right there, and report server, so that the virtual directory name is the same, but how I get there is different. Okay? And localhost will work for this URL as well. Okay, so when I click apply, that will put in effect that certificate. And I'll try that. And as you can see, it goes through, it attempts to install it and so forth. This certificate just isn't valid for this machine for this usage. So I'm not going to jump through the hoops to get it to work. But that's the process. So with a real certificate from a trusted third-party certificate authority, you'd be able to install it. Okay, you can also use this advanced button to come in here and create multiple SSL identities for the report server web service. So if I click on add, it's basically all the same selections. And I can select that and click on OK. It'll do that. It's still not going to let me create it when I click on OK. So I'm just going to cancel out of this. But the nice thing here is that if you need to install multiple certificates and use multiple ports, then you can do that here. Okay? All right, so I'll go ahead and cancel out of that. All right, so once you've successfully bound the certificate to this reporting services instance for the web service URL, you can use port 443 or whatever port you specified to access the URL with SSL, encrypting the data as it travels between the client and the server. Okay, so the next thing we would need to do is then secure the access to the report manager URL. And you do that here on the report manager URL configuration page. Notice that it doesn't provide a place to add the certificate immediately on this page of the configuration manager. So here you have to go into advanced and go through the same steps that I just showed you. Click there, select the certificate, click on OK, and then that will enable it for access using Report Manager. I'll click on OK. It'll go through the same steps. And it again fails because this server just is not set up to be able to use that IIS Express Development Certificate. So in normal cases, again with a real certificate, you would then have it bound and you'd be able to use those two different URLs that are displayed. If you follow the steps that I just showed you to make SSL available for the web service URL and Report Manager URL, you can use SSL with any application that supports it to access the report server. But in some scenarios, you don't just want to enable SSL. Instead, you want to enable SSL and require its use in all communications with the report server. To require SSL for interactions with reporting services, you need to edit the secure connection level setting that you find in the rs-reportserver.config file. The secure connection level setting can be set to a value between 0 and 3. 0 means it's not secure. Reporting services never requires SSL, although you can use it if available. This is the default value. Which makes sense. It's an insecure setting, but a new server is not probably going to have an SSL certificate installed and configured for use. Okay, then a value of 1 is minimally secure. This requires SSL for establishing connections and passing report data. It's still possible, though, for sensitive data to be sent from the client to the server before the server rejects the request. 2 is a little bit better. It's secure. All rendered reports and web service calls require SSL. And then level 3 is the most secure. It requires SSL for everything, including all SOAP API calls to reporting services. So let's take a look at how you can change this setting within the config file. Here I have that rs-reportserver.config file opened in Visual Studio 2013. Just keep in mind where that's located. You can see the path to it. And this path may change a little bit depending upon how you installed reporting services. Fortunately, this key is very close to the top. Notice that it is a child of the configuration root element, and it just uses this add key equals secure connection level. Notice the default value is 0. I haven't changed this value. This is how reporting services was originally installed. So now, if I wanted to make this server as secure as possible for network communications, I would come over here and change that to a 3, and then save the file. Then I'd need to restart reporting services in order to clear any open sessions. And then, once I've made this change, in fact, if I change it to 1 or greater, a positive integer, and I attempt to connect to the report server or report manager on a non-secure connection, in other words, using HTTP instead of HTTPS and or the wrong port, then you encounter an HTTP 404 error that says the page can't be found because the server can't render that page across that connection.